Inside Pelican Bay, America's most feared prison. The Yard of Silence. The prison yard is dead quiet. Hundreds of men walk in slow circles, eyes down, their muscles tense like coiled springs. The silence isn't peace, it's fear. Everyone knows that the wrong look, the wrong step can spark a war. Then it happens. A stare. A nod. And suddenly chaos. A blade flashes in the sun. A man drops, clutching his side as blood spreads across his shirt. Sirens erupt. Guards scream for everyone to get down. Gun towers load their rifles, ready to fire if the violence spreads. For most people, this would be the most terrifying moment of their lives. But at Pelican Bay, this is just another day. How did this place earn its reputation as America's most feared prison? The birth of a monster. In 1989, California opened Pelican Bay State Prison in a remote, foggy corner near the Oregon border. From the outside, it looked like a fortress, gray concrete walls, endless razor wire, and guard towers that could see every inch of the yard. But what made Pelican Bay different was the Security Housing Unit, or SHU. The SHU was designed to hold the worst of the worst, men too violent, too connected, or too dangerous to mix with anyone else. The cells were small concrete boxes, sealed tight with no windows to the outside. Prisoners spent 22 to 23 hours a day inside. Their meals came through a slot. Their yard time was an empty concrete pen, alone, surrounded by walls too high to see over. Prison officials thought this would break the gangs. Instead, it gave them a new base of operations. From inside the SHU, gang leaders controlled criminal empires. They sent coded messages through lawyers, used visitors to smuggle notes, and gave orders that stretched far beyond the walls. The Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia all called Pelican Bay home, and from here they grew stronger than ever. At first, the prison seemed calm. Violence dipped. But that silence was deceptive. Pelican Bay wasn't solving the problem. It was storing it, like a bomb waiting to explode. And then it did. The war behind the walls. By the early 1990s, Pelican Bay's fragile order shattered. The SHU gangs were pulling strings on the main yards, ordering hits, starting riots, and settling scores. Inmates clashed in bloody battles. Makeshift knives made from scrap metal and plastic food trays tore through flesh. Guards in watchtowers fired warning shots, sometimes even live rounds, into the chaos. The worst came in 1993, when hundreds of prisoners erupted into a full-scale riot. Rival gangs turned the yard into a battlefield. Blood covered the concrete. Some men fell and never got back up. The air reeked of tear gas and gunpowder as guards fought to regain control. The prison had been built to contain violence. Instead, it created a pressure cooker. And when the riot ended, the survivors were dragged back to their cells. But everyone knew, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Life in the SHU. For the men who ended up in the SHU, life was worse than prison. It was slow death. Imagine sitting in a cell barely bigger than your bathroom. The lights never fully turn off. The walls are thick, swallowing sound until the silence feels heavier than chains. Prisoners spent years, sometimes decades, this way. They couldn't see the sun. Couldn't touch another human being. Conversations with guards were limited to orders barked through the door. Over time, minds began to break. Some inmates started talking to themselves. Others scratched words into the walls until their fingers bled. Some screamed until their voices collapsed into silence. Psychologists warned that this much isolation was torture for the human mind. But officials insisted it was necessary. And yet, even locked away, the gangs adapted. They used invisible ink, secret hand signs, and coded letters to direct business both inside and outside. Murders on the streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco were traced back to orders sent from inside Pelican Bay. The SHU was meant to control. Instead, it became a nerve center. And then prisoners began fighting back. Not with weapons, but with their own bodies. The hunger strike. In 2011, a new kind of rebellion shook Pelican Bay. Thousands of inmates refused to eat. Their demand? An end to indefinite solitary confinement. Some men had been in the SHU for over 20 years without a single violent act inside prison. Others were placed there simply because of gang affiliation with no end date. The hunger strike grew fast. Within days, prisoners across California joined in. Food trays sat untouched. Men grew pale, weak, some collapsing in their cells. Guards tried to force meals on them, but many resisted. For the first time, the outside world began to pay attention. Families of inmates spoke out. Human rights groups compared the SHU to torture chambers. News outlets broadcast images of skeletal prisoners refusing food. Prison officials cracked down, but the movement spread. And eventually lawsuits reached the courts. Judges were forced to decide, was Pelican Bay's SHU a necessary tool, or cruel and unusual punishment? By 2015, California was ordered to change. Thousands of men were released from solitary into the general population. For some, it was a second chance. For others, it was fuel for revenge. And almost immediately, new violence followed. The legacy of fear. Today, Pelican Bay still stands, a fortress on the edge of the Pacific coast. Its gray walls cut into the fog, its towers armed and watching. The SHU isn't packed like it once was, but its memory still haunts the prison system. Inside, gangs continue to influence life on the yards. Some inmates, freed from decades of solitary, struggle to adapt. They walk like ghosts, eyes scanning every corner, still expecting violence at every turn. And the violence hasn't stopped. In 2018, a massive brawl broke out on one of the yards involving dozens of prisoners. Guards fired warning shots, tear gas filled the air, and the yard once again turned into chaos. Proof that Pelican Bay's fear runs deep, even decades after its birth. For the men locked inside, Pelican Bay isn't just a prison. It's a place where silence screams louder than words, where time moves differently, and where every day could end in blood. The blood-stained yard. The 2018 riot was unlike anything guards had seen in years. Dozens of inmates swarmed across the yard, their fists and makeshift blades cutting through the chaos. Some climbed fences, others charged at rival groups. From the guard towers, officers fired warning shots into the dirt. The crack of gunfire echoed across the prison yard, but it didn't stop the fighting. Tear gas canisters hissed, filling the air with choking smoke. When the dust finally settled, bodies lay sprawled across the concrete, bleeding, bruised, some lifeless. The prison sirens wailed long after the last man was dragged away. To outsiders this was shocking. But for Pelican Bay, it was a reminder of an old truth: the fear never left. And yet, as the world looked at the violence, another hidden story was unfolding. One far from the prison yard, deep inside the walls of the SHU. Whispers in the walls. Even after reforms, the SHU still holds some of the most dangerous men in America. The cells are concrete tombs, but the whispers inside them don't die. Investigators discovered coded letters traveling out of the prison. In one case, a simple note hidden inside legal paperwork carried an order for a killing hundreds of miles away. In another, a guard caught an inmate writing in lemon juice, using invisible ink to send messages to his gang. The SHU had changed, but the gangs hadn't. Their leaders still found ways to send signals, to move drugs, and to control soldiers both inside and outside. Guards say it's like fighting shadows. They see the violence, they intercept the notes, but they can never stop all of it. And then one night, a secret message slipped through, and it sparked a killing inside Pelican Bay itself. Murder in the cell block. It started with a rivalry that stretched beyond the walls. Two gangs with decades of bad blood. The order came quietly, hidden in a legal document, passed cell to cell until it reached the yard. One morning, as prisoners lined up for breakfast, the silence shattered. A man lunged at his rival with a sharpened piece of metal carved from a bed frame. The attack was so fast, so brutal, that guards barely had time to react. The victim collapsed in the chow hall, his blood pooling across the floor tiles. Prisoners screamed. Officers tackled the attacker, dragging him out in chains. The rest of the inmates were forced to the ground, their hands over their heads as alarms echoed through the prison. The message was clear. Even inside the most secure prison in America, murder was still just one order away. And if one killing could happen, more could follow. The ghosts of solitary. But not every danger inside Pelican Bay comes from the gangs. Some comes from the prison itself. Years of solitary confinement left deep scars. When reforms released men from the SHU back into the general population, not all of them could handle it. Some walked the yards like shadows, silent, paranoid, unable to trust anyone. Others lashed out. One inmate, after spending nearly 25 years in isolation, attacked his cellmate within days of being moved. Guards later said he had forgotten how to live around people. Psychologists called it SHU syndrome, a kind of permanent damage caused by extreme isolation. Men who lived too long in silence often carried it with them, even when the cell doors finally opened. And in Pelican Bay, that damage sometimes ended in blood. The storm that never ends. Today, Pelican Bay still stands as a fortress of fear. Its walls rise out of the fog like a warning. The gangs haven't disappeared. The scars of solitary haven't healed. And the violence hasn't stopped. Every day, guards walk the tiers knowing one wrong move could spark a riot. Every meal, every yard time, every lockdown is a test of survival. And for the prisoners inside, the nightmare never truly ends. Some fight. Some give up. And some spend their lives waiting for the next order, the next blade, the next scream in the dark. Because at Pelican Bay, the question isn't if violence will strike again. The question is when. The watchtowers of control. High above the yards, the watchtowers stand like silent gods. From behind bulletproof glass, correctional officers watch every movement below. Their rifles are always loaded, their eyes trained on the smallest signs of trouble. To most prisons, towers are a deterrent. At Pelican Bay, they are a necessity. When a fight breaks out, the guards don't rush in with batons. They fire warning shots from above. Sometimes the shots are into the ground. Sometimes into the air. And in the most desperate moments, they aim at the prisoners themselves. In one infamous incident, a guard fired into a crowd during a riot. The bullet struck an inmate, ending the fight instantly. The yard froze in silence, hundreds of men lying face down on the concrete, hands on their heads while sirens wailed. For the officers in the towers, it's a grim job, deciding in seconds whether to pull the trigger. For the inmates, it's a constant reminder. Every step, every glance, every breath is under the crosshairs. And yet, even the towers can't see everything. Because sometimes, violence brews in the places the guards can't watch. The underground trade. Behind the steel doors, Pelican Bay runs on more than rules. It runs on trade. Cigarettes, food, clothing, even tiny pieces of metal, everything has value. And in the shadows, a black market thrives. Inmates use hand signals, coded notes, and even the plumbing system to pass contraband from cell to cell. Guards have found drugs hidden inside legal envelopes, weapons carved from toothbrushes, and even crude cell phones smuggled in through visiting rooms. The most dangerous currency of all? Information. One whispered rumor about a green light on a rival gang member could decide whether he lived or died by the end of the week. The prison tries to lock down these trades, but the economy never truly dies. It only changes shape. And one day, the underground economy turned deadly when a simple debt sparked a chain of violence that spread across the yard. The debt that cost a life. It began with something small, a few packs of cigarettes owed from one inmate to another. But inside Pelican Bay, nothing is ever small. Debts are about respect. And disrespect can't be tolerated. When the payment didn't come, whispers spread. The debtor was marked. A kite, a small folded paper, moved through the cell blocks. The message was clear: handle it. Days later, during yard time, the hit was carried out. 2 men cornered the debtor against the wall. One held him down while the other drove a sharpened piece of metal into his chest. Guards fired warning shots, but by the time they reached him, it was too late. All for a handful of cigarettes. The killing sent shockwaves through the prison. Everyone knew, if a life could be taken for so little, then no one was safe. And as the body was wheeled off the yard, prisoners stared silently, waiting for the next move. The pressure of the outside world. While chaos erupted inside, the outside world was watching. Families of inmates filed complaints. Activists staged protests, demanding investigations into Pelican Bay's conditions. News outlets published exposés showing the harsh reality of the SHU cells. Lawyers brought lawsuits, arguing that long-term solitary confinement was cruel and unconstitutional. The courts agreed, forcing California to reduce isolation and release hundreds of men back into the main yards. But the outside world didn't understand what this meant for those inside. Suddenly, men who had spent decades alone were thrown back into a world of noise, crowds, and chaos. Some adjusted. Others snapped. One former SHU inmate, free for only weeks, stabbed another prisoner during mealtime. His explanation was chilling: "I forgot how to live around people." The reforms meant to bring peace instead unleashed a new wave of violence. The riot nobody forgot. In the years after the reforms, tensions boiled over again. In one infamous incident, 2 rival gangs faced off in the yard. What began as a few insults turned into a battle involving nearly 100 men. The yard erupted. Homemade blades slashed. Fists cracked against bone. Prisoners grabbed rocks from the ground and hurled them like weapons. Guards sounded the alarms, towers opened fire with rubber bullets, and tear gas filled the air. But the fight raged on. By the time order was restored, dozens of men lay injured. Some would never recover. The prison locked down for weeks after that, cells sealed tight, food delivered through slots. But everyone inside knew, it was only a matter of time before the next explosion. Because Pelican Bay is more than a prison. It's a storm. A storm that never ends. The cold routine. Every morning in Pelican Bay starts the same. The buzz of electric doors. The echo of boots down the tier. Metal slots sliding open as trays of food are shoved inside. Oatmeal, maybe powdered eggs, always cold by the time it reaches the cell. For some inmates, the routine is all they have. Wake up. Push-ups. Count time. Stare at the walls. Wait for the next tray. But beneath this routine, tension simmers. Inmates plan, whisper, scheme, using scraps of paper or signals passed from one cell to another. The guards know it. That's why every movement, every sound is watched. A cough at the wrong moment, a look exchanged through the bars, it could mean something more. Most days end without incident. But on one morning the routine shattered, and Pelican Bay erupted in a way that made even the guards tremble. The knife in the shadows. It happened during yard release. Groups of prisoners shuffled into the open pen, watched from the towers above. At first, everything seemed normal. Men pacing in circles, lifting makeshift weights, staring into the distance. Then, without warning, an inmate pulled a blade. It wasn't metal from outside, it was prison-made, carved from melted plastic, hardened into a deadly point. He charged his target with lightning speed. The victim barely had time to scream before the knife struck. Chaos exploded. Some inmates joined the attack, others scattered, and the guards rushed in. The towers fired warning shots, bullets kicking up dirt at their feet. The man on the ground bled heavily as officers dragged him away. The attacker was cuffed, face pressed into the concrete, his weapon still dripping red. It wasn't just a fight. It was a message. Someone, somewhere, had given the order. And in Pelican Bay, when one man bleeds, more blood always follows. The code of silence. After the stabbing, investigators swarmed the prison. They questioned inmates, searched cells, intercepted letters. But no one talked. Inside Pelican Bay, silence is survival. Snitches don't last long. Men who talk too much disappear, sometimes in the shower, sometimes in the yard. Everyone knows the code. You see nothing, you hear nothing, you say nothing. This silence is what makes the prison so dangerous. Guards know violence is coming, but they don't know when. Prisoners know who ordered the hit, but they'll never speak it aloud. The result? Tension grows like a storm cloud. And one night, when the prison thought it was quiet, the silence was broken by screams echoing through the tiers. Murder in the night. It started with banging, metal clanging against metal. Guards rushed to the block, thinking it was just another inmate throwing a tantrum. But when they reached the cell, they found blood smeared across the floor. One inmate lay lifeless, his throat cut with a piece of sharpened glass. His cellmate sat calmly in the corner, weapon still in hand, staring at the wall. The prison went into full lockdown. Every inmate was stripped, searched, and sealed behind steel doors. Officers combed through cells looking for contraband, tearing apart mattresses and ripping out toilets. But the truth was chilling. The murder wasn't random. It was another order carried out in silence. And if one cell could become a killing ground overnight, any cell could. The endless lockdown. After the killing, Pelican Bay locked down for weeks. Inmates didn't see the yard. Meals came cold through slots. Conversations were drowned out by silence. For some prisoners, lockdown was punishment. For others, it was safety. Nobody knew when the doors would open again, or what would happen when they did. But lockdowns can't last forever. And when the gates finally rolled open again, the prison returned to its fragile routine. Everyone knew it wouldn't last. Because in Pelican Bay, the calm is just the pause before the next storm. The walls that breathe fear. Pelican Bay's walls aren't just concrete, they're alive with whispers. Every block has its own rhythm. The clang of doors, the shuffle of boots, the coughs, the coded knocks passed from cell to cell. To a new inmate, the silence feels crushing. But to veterans, it's a language. A knock on the wall at midnight might mean a message has arrived. A tray pushed too slowly through the slot could signal danger. Guards sense it too. They say they can feel tension in the air before violence erupts. It's like the prison itself holds its breath, waiting. And then one day, during what seemed like an ordinary meal, that silence cracked wide open. The Chow Hall ambush. The Chow Hall is one of the only places where prisoners gather in large numbers. Long metal tables. Guards stationed at the corners. The smell of powdered potatoes and canned beans drifting through the air. It was during lunch when it happened. Two rival gang members spotted each other across the room. At first nothing, just glares. Then one man stood, tray in hand. He slammed it into the other's face, sending food flying. Chaos exploded. Dozens of inmates jumped up, fists swinging, knives flashing from hidden pockets. Guards shouted, their radios crackling with calls for backup. Trays turned into weapons. Blood spilled across the floor. The chow hall turned into a battlefield. And as guards rushed in swinging batons, one inmate collapsed, his body motionless, trampled under the stampede. The chow hall was locked down that day. But everyone knew, if violence could erupt here, it could happen anywhere. The silent aftermath. After the ambush, Pelican Bay went eerily quiet. Prisoners walked slower. Conversations dropped to whispers. Everyone was waiting to see if there would be payback. Guards doubled their patrols. Yard time was cut short. Cells were searched for hidden weapons. Still nothing was found. It was as if the prison was holding its breath again, the silence more dangerous than the riot itself. Inside the SHU, gang leaders sent out new orders. Men sharpened toothbrushes into points, hid razor blades under mattresses and waited. The silence didn't mean peace. It meant something worse. And when the yard gates opened again, the storm finally hit. The yard riot. The sun hadn't even reached its peak when the yard erupted. Two groups charged at each other across the concrete, one armed with makeshift knives, the other with sharpened sticks. It was fast, brutal, bloody. Men fell, screaming as the towers fired live rounds into the ground. Tear gas filled the air, choking everyone, guards included. One officer shouted through a megaphone demanding the inmates get down. But they didn't listen. The fighting raged on, and for a terrifying moment, it looked like the guards were losing control completely. Only when the gas became unbearable did the men finally collapse to the ground. Cuffed, dragged away, their faces streaked with blood and sweat. But the damage was done. Several lay injured. At least one would never rise again. And the worst part? Everyone knew this riot wasn't the end, it was only the opening shot of something bigger. The chain reaction. Violence doesn't end with one fight at Pelican Bay. It spreads. What started with a tray in the chow hall had become a riot in the yard. Now word spread to other blocks. Messages, tiny folded kites, moved between cells, carried in laundry, hidden in legal mail. Every gang prepared for the next move. Guards could feel it. They tightened lockdowns, checked every corner, but they couldn't stop it. And then one night, deep inside a cell block, an officer doing routine rounds heard a scream. He rushed to the bars and froze. Another inmate lay slumped in his bunk, his body torn apart by a hidden blade. The storm was spreading. And Pelican Bay was once again on the edge of all-out war. The guards on edge. After the killing in the cell block, Pelican Bay went into full crisis mode. Guards worked double shifts, their nerves stretched thin. Every sound, every clang of metal, every echo in the corridor, made them tighten their grip on their batons. For the officers, the job was more than dangerous, it was a gamble. They walked into tears knowing that behind every door, a man might be waiting with a weapon, with rage, with nothing left to lose. Some guards tried to keep it professional. Others admitted the fear ate at them. They went home with adrenaline still pumping, unable to sleep, haunted by the thought of how close they'd come to violence. And their fears weren't misplaced. Because one day during a routine escort, a guard faced an attack that would shake Pelican Bay to its core. The escort attack. It was supposed to be a simple movement. One inmate being transferred from his cell to a disciplinary hearing. He was shackled, hands cuffed, feet chained. Two officers walked him down the narrow hallway. But Pelican Bay inmates are masters of improvisation. Hidden in his clothing was a sharpened piece of metal, smuggled and concealed with precision. Halfway down the corridor, the inmate spun, lunging at the closest guard. The blade slashed across the officer's vest, inches from his throat. The second guard tackled the prisoner, wrestling him to the ground as alarms screamed through the block. Backup rushed in, subduing the attacker, but the message was clear. Even in chains, even shackled head to toe, a Pelican Bay inmate could still strike. The officer survived, shaken but alive. But the prison was rattled. If escorts weren't safe, then nowhere was. The lockdown tension. The attack triggered another lockdown. Cells slammed shut. Movement froze. Prisoners stared through the bars, silent, their faces expressionless but their minds racing. For weeks, men sat in darkness, restless, plotting. Guards searched every corner, every mattress, every crack in the walls for contraband. They found blades, makeshift weapons, even notes hinting at more violence to come. The longer the lockdown lasted, the heavier the silence became. Some inmates began yelling just to hear their own voices. Others tapped codes through the pipes, carrying messages cell to cell. And then, just when it seemed things might settle, a fire broke out, deep in one of the blocks. The fire in the block. Smoke filled the corridors. Prisoners coughed and shouted as flames licked up from a burning mattress. Guards rushed in with extinguishers, but chaos spread faster than the fire itself. Some inmates banged on their doors, screaming for release. Others cheered, banging in rhythm on the bars, using the fire as a distraction. The blaze was eventually contained, but not before black smoke coated the ceilings and panic swept through the prison. When the smoke cleared, guards realized the fire wasn't an accident. It was set deliberately, meant to test how fast the officers would respond. And if the fire was just a test, everyone knew what would come next. The day of reckoning. The test ended in flames. The response would come in blood. On a gray morning, the yard gates opened. Inmates shuffled out in groups, the air thick with tension. Guards on the tower scanned nervously, radios buzzing with warnings. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one knew when. Then, with terrifying precision, two groups charged each other. It wasn't random, it was planned. Dozens of men clashed in the center of the yard, fists and blades tearing into flesh. The towers opened fire, rubber bullets, then real ones. Sirens screamed. Tear gas rolled over the yard. But the fighting didn't stop. Not until the concrete was stained red, and the prison yard looked less like a place of punishment and more like a battlefield. When it ended, bodies were dragged away, both prisoners and guards injured. Some wouldn't make it. And in the silence that followed, Pelican Bay once again proved its reputation. A place where fear rules, violence never ends, and survival is the only law. The yard aftermath. When the smoke cleared from the riot, Pelican Bay looked like a war zone. The concrete was stained. The yard was littered with broken weapons, sharpened pieces of metal, jagged shards of plastic, blood-soaked rags. Survivors were dragged back to their cells, their faces bruised, their clothes torn. Some limped, others were carried. The dead were zipped into black bags and wheeled away under the silent gaze of the towers. For the guards, exhaustion set in. But more than exhaustion, it was dread. Everyone knew that riots don't end with cleanup. They breed retaliation. And now, with blood spilled on both sides, everyone inside Pelican Bay was waiting for the next move. The silence afterward was the kind that made even the toughest inmates uneasy. Because silence in Pelican Bay never meant peace, it meant plotting. The secret orders. While the prison was on edge, the gang leaders inside the SHU were already at work. From their windowless cells they passed coded messages, kites, through legal mail, laundry, and even food trays. One message was intercepted by investigators. It wasn't long, but it was chilling. Green light. Full go. That meant war. The guards didn't know when or how the strike would come. They only knew it was coming. So they doubled security. They searched every block, tore through mattresses, even ripped out ceiling tiles. Still the orders spread. And one day, in the middle of what seemed like a normal cell search, an officer stumbled into the middle of an ambush. The cell block ambush. The search team moved in, flashlights sweeping across the concrete. One officer opened a cell door. The inmate inside looked calm, too calm. Then with lightning speed he lunged. A sharpened piece of steel hidden in his clothing flashed in the dim light. The officer stumbled back, his vest saving him from a fatal strike. Chaos erupted. Other inmates began banging on their doors, shouting, drowning the block in noise. Guards rushed in, wrestling the attacker to the ground as radios screamed for backup. The ambush had failed, but barely. And the message was clear. The gangs weren't done. They were testing the guards, probing, waiting for their chance. The question was, what would that chance look like? The ghosts of solitary. Amid the chaos, another battle was being fought, not with knives or fists but inside the minds of men. For decades, Pelican Bay's SHU had buried prisoners in silence. Some spent 20, even 30 years in isolation. When reforms released them back into general population, many were broken. One man, after decades alone, walked into the yard and froze. The noise, the crowd, the movement, it was too much. He crouched in the corner, rocking back and forth, unable to process the world around him. Others became violent. Psychologists called it SHU syndrome, a kind of permanent damage where isolation rewired the brain. This mental collapse was its own kind of danger. Because a man who has nothing left, no fear, no logic, no hope, can be more dangerous than any gang soldier. And one day that truth exploded in blood. The madman strike. It happened during evening yard. One of the former SHU inmates, quiet for weeks, suddenly snapped. Without warning, he rushed another prisoner, swinging a blade carved from a toothbrush. The attack was wild, savage, fueled not by orders but by madness. Guards shouted commands, but the man didn't stop. He stabbed again and again, his screams echoing off the concrete walls. By the time officers tackled him, the yard was slick with blood. The victim barely survived. The attacker was dragged back to isolation. his face blank, eyes hollow, as if he didn't even know what he had done. The riot was bad enough. The gang orders were terrifying. But this was something new. Something unpredictable. And unpredictability inside Pelican Bay is more dangerous than any gang war. The retaliation plot. After the madman's attack, the prison was rattled. But for the gangs, it wasn't chaos, it was opportunity. The violence had pulled guards' focus in one direction, leaving space for other plans to move quietly. Leaders inside the SHU passed out coded orders. Folded kites hidden in laundry. Messages tucked into books. One order spread through the blocks like wildfire: strike back. Hard. The yard grew tense. Conversation stopped when guards walked by. Prisoners sharpened plastic scraps into blades, hid them in shoes, or tucked them into mattresses. Guards could feel it. The air was heavy, thick with something about to break. And then one evening the first strike came. The shower block killing. The showers in Pelican Bay are supposed to be controlled. One inmate at a time. Guards standing watch. But even here death found a way. An inmate stepped in for his shower. Minutes later, screams echoed down the block. Guards rushed in and found him bleeding out, stabbed again and again with a weapon smuggled inside. The killer stood calmly, weapon still dripping, as if the act had been routine. Guards slammed him against the wall, cuffed him and dragged him away. It was a chilling reminder: Pelican Bay doesn't need riots to kill. Even the most ordinary moments, like a shower, can become death traps. And everyone knew the killing wouldn't stay isolated. It was the spark to ignite the whole prison. The riot that shook the prison. It started small, a fight between two men on the yard. But in Pelican Bay nothing stays small. Within seconds dozens of inmates joined in. Knives flashed. Rocks flew. Blood sprayed across the concrete. The guards fired tear gas. The towers fired rubber bullets. Radios screamed with calls for backup. The yard transformed into a battlefield of smoke, fists and screams. When it ended, the ground was stained red. Dozens injured. Several dead. It was one of the largest riots Pelican Bay had seen in years. And as the injured were dragged off, as the dead were zipped into body bags, the truth sank in. This wasn't just a riot. It was war. The lockdown of fear. The riot forced Pelican Bay into another lockdown. Cells sealed. Yard closed. Food pushed through slots. Lights dimmed. For weeks, the prison was silent. Guards walked their rounds nervously. Inmates stared at the walls, plotting, waiting. The air itself seemed heavy, as if the whole prison was holding its breath. Lockdowns are supposed to cool things down. But at Pelican Bay they only build pressure. Every day in silence adds to the storm. And when the doors finally roll open, the violence often comes back worse than before. And this time, the violence returned in a way no one expected. The hit list. During a routine search, guards uncovered a piece of paper hidden inside a cell. On it was a list, names of inmates and, shockingly, names of correctional officers. Each name had a mark beside it. It was a hit list. And it meant the violence wasn't random anymore. It was organized, calculated, planned. The discovery sent a wave of panic through the prison. Guards were warned to watch their backs, even off duty. Inmates whispered about who would be targeted next. The prison tightened security, but it didn't matter. Because once a name is on the list at Pelican Bay, it usually gets crossed out in blood. The guards' fear. The hit list changed everything. Guards who once walked the tiers with authority now moved with caution. Every shadow in the corridor felt like a threat. Every glance from a prisoner carried a new weight. Some officers admitted they were scared, not just for themselves but for their families. Rumors swirled that gangs inside Pelican Bay were reaching beyond the walls, targeting officers' homes, even their loved ones. At roll call, one veteran guard said quietly, "This place doesn't sleep. If they want you, they'll find you. In here or out there." And then came the day that proved his words weren't just fear, they were prophecy. The stabbing in the corridor. It happened fast. A guard was escorting an inmate back from a medical checkup. The prisoner was cuffed, shackled, under control, or so it seemed. But in Pelican Bay, control is an illusion. The inmate had hidden a sharpened shard of metal in his waistband, slipped from his cuffs with a trick he'd practiced for weeks. As they turned a corner, he struck. The blade tore through the guard's vest, slicing deep. The corridor echoed with shouts, boots pounding, alarms blaring. The officer fell, clutching his side, blood soaking his uniform. He survived, but barely. And word spread fast. The hit list wasn't just a threat anymore. It was real. The crackdown. The stabbing forced Pelican Bay into one of its harshest crackdowns in years. Every inmate was stripped, searched and locked down. Guards raided cells, tearing apart mattresses, ripping out vents, smashing toilets to find hidden weapons. Dozens of knives were recovered, some crude, some terrifyingly sharp. Notes were seized, kites intercepted, whispers silenced. But the more the guards found, the clearer it became. They were only scratching the surface. The gangs weren't just surviving the lockdown. They were thriving in it. The prison was their chessboard, and every move the officers made had already been anticipated. And soon, the gangs would make their next move, a move that would shake Pelican Bay to its foundation. The yard betrayal. After weeks of lockdown, the prison reopened the yard under strict watch. Prisoners moved slowly, watched by armed towers, every step measured. At first it seemed calm. Men paced, stretched, lifted weights. But then betrayal struck. Two inmates who were supposed to be allies suddenly turned on each other. One pulled a blade, stabbing the other repeatedly in the open yard. Guards shouted, towers fired, prisoners dropped flat to the ground. The betrayal stunned everyone. Was it personal? Or was it planned by higher powers? An order from the SHU meant to send a message? The answer wasn't clear. But the chaos it unleashed spread like wildfire. The day the towers fired, the betrayal triggered a chain reaction. Rival groups exploded into violence across the yard. It wasn't just fists, blades slashed, blood sprayed, men dropped. The guards had no choice. From the towers, rifles fired live rounds. Bullets struck the ground, the fences, and, fatally, two inmates who refused to stop fighting. The yard went silent. Bodies sprawled across the concrete, unmoving. The survivors lay face down, their hands over their heads, the smell of blood and tear gas mixing in the cold air. 4 years, Pelican Bay had threatened to become ungovernable. On that day it nearly was. And in the aftermath, with bodies cooling on the concrete, a chilling question remained. If even towers with rifles couldn't stop the violence, what could? The retaliation in chains. After the towers fired live rounds, Pelican Bay locked down once again. But the gangs weren't finished. They had taken losses, and losses always demand retaliation. One morning, during a chained escort, 3 inmates moved down the corridor in silence. Guards walked close, their rifles ready. But in a flash, one prisoner broke formation. He slipped his cuffs loose, he'd filed them down over weeks, unnoticed, and lunged at the guard. A sharpened weapon appeared from nowhere, slicing through the air. The officer barely dodged the strike, his partner tackling the prisoner to the ground as alarms blared. The corridor filled with shouting, boots, and panic. The attack failed. But the message didn't. The gangs were still watching, still planning, still ready to kill even in chains. The walls that whisper death. Investigators scrambled to understand how the gangs were still communicating. More searches. More raids. But every sweep turned up the same thing, hidden kites with coded messages. One letter intercepted read, "Blood for blood." Until balance is restored. The prison braced for another wave of violence. Guards wore heavier vests. Yard time was shortened. But the gangs were patient. They knew fear spreads faster than knives. And then, without warning, the balance was struck, deep inside one of the cell blocks. The midnight murder. It happened in the dead of night. Guards making rounds found a cell unusually quiet. When they looked inside, one inmate was sprawled across his bunk, his body motionless. His cellmate sat in the corner, his shirt soaked in blood, a crude blade still in his hand. The killer said nothing. He just stared. The news spread quickly. Even in lockdown, even under constant surveillance, the violence couldn't be stopped. Pelican Bay was a place where death could come silently, without warning, from the man sharing your cell. The prison went into another full lockdown. But this time the silence felt different. Heavier. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The storm that broke the prison. The silence didn't last. It never does. When the lockdown finally lifted, the yards opened cautiously. Men walked slowly, watched from every angle. Guards were nervous. Prisoners were restless. And then, as if on cue, chaos erupted. Dozens of inmates charged each other in a wave of violence. Blades flashed. Blood sprayed. The towers fired. Tear gas choked the air. This wasn't just another riot, it was the storm everyone had feared. Months of tension, orders, and retaliation exploding all at once. The prison shook with violence, and for a terrifying moment, even the guards couldn't tell if they could regain control. When it finally ended, the yard was littered with bodies. The survivors were dragged back in chains. And Pelican Bay was left scarred, again. The legacy of fear. In the aftermath, the prison returned to its cycle of silence and blood. The walls stood tall, the towers kept watch, and the routines carried on. But inside, everyone knew the truth. Pelican Bay isn't just a prison. It's a world ruled by fear. For the guards, every day is survival. For the inmates, every breath could be their last. And for the gangs, Pelican Bay is more than a cage, it's a command center. Decades after its creation, Pelican Bay still lives up to its name, America's most feared prison. Not because of its walls or its towers or its isolation cells, but because inside those walls, silence is never peace. It's the sound of something worse, something waiting. And at Pelican Bay, the waiting always ends in blood.